And yesterday in Israel, there was a funeral. They say close to 750,000 Jews, or 500,000 Jews. Hagar Reb Chaim Kanevsky of blessed memory. Yeah, this is a Jew who was born in 1928 in Pinsk. That's Russia, Belarus. Then I think it was Poland. No, it was Belarus, I think. Belarus, Lithuania. He moved to Israel in 1934 with his father, the Stipler, Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael Kanevsky, who was a name after Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael of Cherkas, who was a son-in-law of the Mittler Rebbe, a brother-in-law of the Tzemach Tzedek, and they settled in Bnei Brak. And, I think probably for around 85, 86 years, a Jew who sat for around 18 hours a day and learned in a little room. So that's very special, very special. And he was a very private person. Last few years, they turned him into a very famous person, but on his own, he was not. I don't think he needed it at all. So we're going to start a new Maamer today. Mitzvahs Tiglachas Metzora. Please open it up. If you're in the Zoom, go to the chat. If you're on the yeshiva.net, you have the source sheet. Let me tell you what this is. This is from a sefer called Derech Mitzvosecha. Derech Mitzvosecha, Tamei HaMitzvos, is a sefer that was written, here you see the jacket, the cover, was written by the Tzemach Tzedek. A few words about the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek is the third Rebbe in the dynasty of Chabad. The founder of Chabad, you all know, is the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who was a student of the Maggid, who was a student of the Baal Shem Tov. The Alter Rebbe was born Tovkuf Hey, 1745, and he passed away 1812. He had children. One of his sons, Rabbeinu Dov Ber, succeeded him after his passing. He's known in Chabad as the Mittler Rebbe, the middle Rebbe, in contrast to the Alter Rebbe, the older Rebbe, Rabbeinu Dov Ber. He passed away in the year Tovkuf Pei Ches. That's 1827, on Tes Kislev. In other words, his leadership began after the Alter Rebbe's passing, which was Tovkuf Ayin Gimel, 1812, the end of 1812, December 1812. And his leadership lasted around 15 years, till 1828, Tovkuf Pei Ches. A year later, the leadership of Chabad went over to his son-in-law, not to his son, to his son-in-law, the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek's name was Rebbe Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch. Rebbe Menachem Mendel, and his mother, Dvara Leah, was a daughter of the Alter Rebbe, and also his wife, Chaya Mushka, was a daughter of the Mittler Rebbe. So he was the Mittler Rebbe's nephew, and he was the Mittler Rebbe's son-in-law. Is that clear? In other words, the Alter Rebbe had a son, Rabbeinu Dov Ber. He had a daughter, Dvara Leah. She had a son, Menachem Mendel, who became the Tzemach Tzedek. She died very, very young. It's a whole story about that. It's not for now. And the Alter Rebbe raised her orphan. Menachem Mendel, he was raised on the lap and the bosom of the Alter Rebbe in his home. He was like his father and his mother. He took care of him. So they had a very close relationship. When the Mittler Rebbe passed away, the Tzemach Tzedek, who was both the son-in-law of the Mittler Rebbe and the nephew of the Mittler Rebbe, became the third Rebbe of Lubavitch. He lived in the city of Lubavitch, and he passed away Tafresh Chavav, which is 1866, before Pesach, Yud Gimel Nis. Just for history purposes, the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was named after him because he was a grandson, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe's wife, Chaya Mushka, was named after the Tzemach Tzedek's wife, who was also Chaya Mushka, a daughter of the Mittler Rebbe. The Tzemach Tzedek was one of the great minds of his generation and of many generations. And he is one of the people who took the Alter Rebbe's teachings and really developed them in a very, very powerful and organized and structured way. As I once heard from the Rebbe, who said it from earlier, that the Alter Rebbe was the Chachma of Chassidus, the Mittler Rebbe was the Bina of Chassidus, and the Tzemach Tzedek was the Das of Chassidus. There's Chachma, Bina, Das. I'm not going to get into exactly what it means now, but if you learn their svarim well and deeply, you see the difference. Chachma bina das. One of the classics of the Tzemach Tzedek is a sefer called Derech Mitzvosecha. This sefer. What is it? He goes through many mitzvahs of the 630 mitzvahs, and he explains the spiritual, emotional, psychological, metaphysical, Kabbalistic and Hasidic meaning behind the mitzvah. Every mitzvah, eating matzah, right? Eating matzah, or blowing shofar, or counting the Maamer. Any mitzvah, there is the concrete element of the mitzvah. I have to hear the shofar, I have to eat the matzah, I have to read the Megillah, I have to light Hanukkah candles, I have to light Shabbos candles. But that's one part of the mitzvah. Then there is the inner dimension of the mitzvah, what it does to my mind, to my soul, to my heart, to my body. And even those mitzvahs that don't apply today, because let's say there's no Beis HaMikdash, the mitzvahs of bringing offerings, still the spiritual dimension of the mitzvah is always applicable. So Derech Mitzvosecha is the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Tzemach Tzedek. He goes through many mitzvahs according to the order of the famous Sefer HaChinuch, which is an encyclopedic list of all the mitzvahs, and he explains the deeper dimension of the mitzvahs. Today we're going to do one of those mitzvahs. It's going to be a series of a few classes, and as you see on top, it's mitzvahs Tiglachas Metzora. If you have a Derech Mitzvosecha, you can use the book. It's page 208 or Daf Kuf Dalet Amud Beis 104b. Or here we have the source sheet, so we go straight to that page. Mitzvahs Tiglachas Metzora. Why did I choose this mitzvah? First of all, it's going to be the upcoming Parshas. This Parshas Shmini deals with purity and impurity, and Tazria and Metzora deals with leprosy and the purity of a leprosy. When he becomes pure, she becomes pure. And a few weeks later, Nasai, down the line, Shavuos time was the Parsha of Naziris, and the Parsha of Saita talks about here. We'll see all these things, but it's connected right away to the Parshas of these coming weeks. So I chose it. And also the theme, obviously, is a theme that's very, very powerful and relevant. The Maamer has two sections. One, the section deals with here. What is the Jewish approach to here? It deals with questions like, why does a nazirite grow his hair? And why did the Levites in the desert have to cut their hair? And why should a married woman cover her hair? What's the meaning of hair in Judaism? Is hair good? Is hair sensual? Is hair constructive? Is hair dangerous? Is hair gorgeous? Do we love hair? Are we scared of hair? Are we allergic to hair? What's the relationship of Judaism to hair? Hair as in Cyrus in Hebrew, Cyrus. And as the Tzemach will say, we'll see contradictory messages, right? Do you leave your hair long? Do you not leave your hair long? What's the relationship of Judaism to hair? Hair is it's a sensitive issue here. It's not, there's a lot of significance in here, which is why you see that people like to express themselves through their hair. I can't express myself much through my hair because I don't have much. But some people express, so they at least try to express themselves through their hair. That's the first part of the Maamer. The second half of the Maamer deals with how people handle the pressures of making a living. The anxiety and stress that comes with the fact that all of us need money to live, or at least many of us need money to live, and our involvement in it. What's the right balance between family and money? What's the right balance between God and having a job? What's the right balance between serenity and tranquility and taking your job seriously? Which is obviously a timeless issue in history, from when Adam HaRishon had to work to make a living until today. But I think today, in the age of anxiety, these issues become even more acute and relevant, at least equally and powerfully relevant today as well. Despite all of the progress that was made with the Industrial Revolution and the Computer Revolution and the Internet Revolution and many other revolutions since the Tzemach Tzedek's days. The Tzemach Tzedek was born Tovkuf Mem Tes, 1789, Erev Rosh Hashanah, the day before Rosh Hashanah. As I said, he passed away Tov Reish Chavav, which is 1866. Yud Gimel Nissen. He was born Erev Rosh Hashanah, passed away Yud Gimel Nissen. Let's start the Maamer. We're going to start the first piece today, and then we're going to continue this over a few shiurim, a few classes. Okay. Okay, so if you didn't open your source sheets, please open them. Again, you could get them on the yeshiva.net, or you could get them here on Zoom if you're here with us on Zoom. Mitzvahs Tiglachas Metzora. This is the mitzvah that deals with the shaving or the cutting off of the hair of the Metzora of the leper. And he's going to explain. This is mitzvah Kuf Ayin Daled, mitzvah 174 in Sefer HaChinuch. I don't know how familiar you are with Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch, we don't even know its author, but it's one of the cardinal and important books in Jewish literature. It was written, they say, probably in the 11th century or the 12th century. Some say by Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Spain, and it's an encyclopedia of all the 613 mitzvahs, mitzvah by mitzvah, based on the order of the portions. It gives you a summation of the mitzvah, and it gives you the reason for the mitzvah. From the perspective of the Sefer HaChinuch, it's a very fundamental, brief, concise. It's a good work to have a very general and brief mastery of what the 613 mitzvahs are. So mitzvah 174 from 613 is in Parshas Tazria and then in Parshas Metzora. What's the mitzvah? Sheyigaleach ha-Metzora kol sa'ori k'sheyitar. That the Metzora, the leper, should cut all of his hair when he becomes purified. Shenemar, the pasuk says, this is Sefer Vayikra, Perik Yud Dalet pasuk Tes. V'haya b'yom hashvi, on the seventh day, Yigaleich is called Sa'ara, he should cut all of his hair, Es Roshai, the hair on the head, Es Skanai, the hair on the beard, Es Gabais Einov, on the eyebrows, V'es Kol Sa'ara, and all of his hair, Yigaleich, he should cut. Vayikra Perik Yud Dalet pasuk Tes. Let me just give you the context. In the Parshas Tazria Metzora, the Torah discusses the symptoms of what we call tsaras. We don't have an exact translation for tsaras because we usually translate it as leprosy. But leprosy is a skin disease, but it's not exactly what tsaras is. It's just the closest English term to tsaras. Tsaras are symptoms that affected a person's skin. Usually there was a white patch in the skin and then the hair became white. Various symptoms of different shades, different colors of white that can affect a person's skin. And under certain conditions, not all, the person, the man or the woman was deemed a Metzora. And there was a process of cleansing. Now these symptoms we don't have today anymore. There's a Maamer in Likutei Torah, Parshas Tazria, which we learned a few years ago. It's on the yeshiva.net and Parshas Tazria. The Alter Rebbe says, what happened? Why do these symptoms not exist anymore? And therefore, these halachas are not relevant, not because they're not relevant, they're relevant, but the symptoms are not here. So what does the Torah say? What happens on the day that the symptoms are gone? So the Kohen comes to examine the Metzora, and then there's a whole process of how he or she goes through the cleansing process of the tsaras, of the leprosy. So the Torah says that after the Metzora bathes, they bathe themselves, they clean all their clothes and cut all the hair and bathe themselves, go to the mikveh. So after that, there's a process where the Metzora waits for 7 days. And then on the 7th day, after the purification, and there's a whole process of the purification with 2 birds. I'm not going to get into all the details now because it's not directly relevant, but you can look it up at the beginning of Parshas Tazria. The whole process. After 7 days, it says that the Metzora needs to cut all of his hair. And that's what he's discussing here. And when you say all of his hair, it's literally his head, his beard, his eyebrows, and all of his hair that he shaves off. And afterwards, he becomes pure on the 8th day. On the 8th day of this process, he brings an offering in the Mishkan of the Beis HaMikdash. And as the Torah says, he's completely pure and life goes back to normal. So this is a mitzvah, literally to cut his hair. V'amru zal, our sages said, V'amru zechronim levrach, our sages of blessed memory said, Shloisha megalchin v'tiglachtan mitzvah. People take haircuts all the time, but it's not a mitzvah. But there are 3 types of haircuts that are a mitzvah. 3. Ha-nazir, v'ha-metzora, v'ha-leviyim. There were 3 types of people. The nazirite, as we'll soon see, the Metzora, the leper, and the Levites, the Levim. Negoyim perik yudalad mishnah dalad. V'ulam, however, shloisha elu einam shavim l'chol divrei. But they're not identical. Shegiluach halaviyim haya l'shah b'midbar ve'ein neheges l'deiris ulefichach lo'imana b'taryag. There's a mitzvah in Parshas Ba'aloischa that all the Leviyim in the desert had to shave off all their hair. But it was a temporary mitzvah, meaning it was not a mitzvah that would be continued over the generations. And that's why it didn't go into the list of 630 mitzvahs. Because 630 mitzvahs only includes mitzvahs that are eternal, that are timeless, that will continue for the generations. Now, when we say that, let me explain what that means. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to do every one of those mitzvahs during all the times, but it means that the mitzvah is applicable to all times. If the circumstances are there, the mitzvah is applicable. But then there are mitzvahs that even if the circumstances are there, they're not applicable for all times. They were mitzvahs that were given at a specific moment, not to be repeated at a later point. You have such mitzvahs. One of them is, for example, there was a mitzvah, one of them is this example, the Leviyim in the desert who were commanded in Parshas Ba'aloischa, a whole parsha over there, to shave off their hair. Not the Koyanim. And by the way, the Medrash says that one of the reasons that Cherish staged a rebellion against Aaron was because Aaron was a Kohen Gadol, and Cherish was his cousin, and Cherish was a Levite, a Levi, and he shaved. And his wife, or other people said, look at the difference. Aaron hat a shene lange bard and du bist a megulach. You're like clean shaven. Look at Aaron, right? The pasuk says in Tehillim, "Skan Aaron, yeah, sheyored al pimi doisov." So Derech got very jealous because he didn't have today. Maybe it would be the other way around. Derech would appreciate his looks. Depends, I guess, what context. But this was one of the reasons why Derech got very upset. So the Medrash says he got upset because Aaron had this lange bard and Derech didn't. But that was not a mitzvah for generations. The Leviim have to shave all their hair. It was a unique thing in the Midbar. Now we're going to see why that's a strange mitzvah. What do you care if a person has hair? Okay, we'll see. But this is a mitzvah that's not forever. It's only then. In other words, the Leviim later did not do it. It was only in the Midbar, in the desert, very, very limited time frame for the mitzvah. Now, somebody's asking, what about all the mitzvahs connected to the Beis HaMikdash are also only a limited time frame? No, they're not. Those are eternal mitzvahs. You need a Beis HaMikdash. But if there would be a Beis HaMikdash, you would have these mitzvahs. There's certain mitzvahs that you need certain conditions to fulfill them, but they're timeless. For example, eating matzah on Pesach. It's not all year, it's on Pesach. But whenever there's a Pesach, there's a mitzvah to eat matzah. When there's a Beis HaMikdash, there's a mitzvah to bring offerings. But it's a timeless mitzvah. The mitzvah of the Leviim was not timeless. It was only during the desert, even though there were Leviim afterwards. That's a very, very big distinction. These mitzvahs do not make it into the list of 630 mitzvahs. You want another example? Moshe told the Jews that when they offer the Korban Pesach in Egypt, they had to put blood on the door. Yeah, it's not a mitzvah that goes into the list. Why? Because it was never repeated. It was just that year. Anything that was only temporary, it's not continuing, doesn't go into the list of 650 mitzvahs. It was a mitzvah that God gave for that time. Not for any other time. This is the mitzvah of shaving the Levine. Next. V'giluach Metzora, v'nazir neheges l'doros. But the shaving of the Metzora and the nazir, this is for generations. Of course, you have to have the circumstances. You'll say, there's no lepers today. You're right. But if there would be a leper today, would the mitzvah apply? Yeah. If there would be a leper and a Beis HaMikdash, the mitzvah would apply. So it's called a mitzvah for generations. Other mitzvahs, even if the circumstances are there, they don't apply. And the same is true, the mitzvah of a nazir, there's also a concept of shaving the hair. And that's why we see that the Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch, the shaving of the nazir is also a mitzvah. It's part of the mitzvah 397. What's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is, this is later in the Chumash in Parshas Monsey. And very briefly, again, I'm just going to do briefly so you know, we understand the context of it. The Torah speaks about a person who decides that he wants to be, or she wants to be a nazirite. The most famous nazirite in Jewish history was who? Samson. In fact, as we're going to understand a little later, Shimshon, his whole strength came from his hair, right? When Delilah found out the secret of Shimshon's hair, and the Philistines managed to cut Shimshon's hair, they could abduct him, they could kidnap him, and ultimately Shimshon Shimshon did not survive. But the concept of a nazir is that a person decides he wants to segregate himself, a man or a woman. They want to segregate themselves somewhat from the material physical world and live a life of aloofness or sacredness or sublimity. So of course they're not allowed to become impurified through a corpse, and there's no intoxication, there's no wine, and there's no grapes. And one of the things is the nazir is not allowed to cut his or her hair. Suddenly the hair has to grow and grow long. You're not allowed to touch the hair all the days that he wants to be a nazir. Now you have a nazir olam. You have people who are a nazir for life. Shimshon, Shmuel, Avshalom. They are allowed to, so for life they don't cut their hair, but because if it becomes very heavy, they're allowed to once a year make it a little lighter simply because of the pressure. But during the time, let's say I want to be a nazir for 30 days or for a year, for 5 years. I'm not going to grow my hair. If you ever see the Rakachava God, and you ever saw pictures of Rabbi Yosef Rosen, he has very long hair. And there's always a question, did he accept upon himself Nazirus? That would be strange. Then he couldn't make Kiddush Friday night and Yom Tov. It's not so clear what happened with the Rakachava, but he had very long hair. You ever saw the Rakachava? Rabbi Yosef Rosen passed away in 1936. He was the Sarah Torah, one of the greatest minds in recent Jewish history, and maybe even of earlier. Rakachava Gun, and he had long hair. So there's different speculations what happened, but the halachas of Nazirus apply even today. They apply even today. In Israel, there was somebody, you remember? Reb David HaNazir, Reb David HaNazir, the Rav of Haifa, Rabbi Shar Yashav Kohen, his father, Rabbi David Cohen. He was known as the Nazir. He had long hair. He wrote a sefer called Tzad HaNavuah, The Secret of Prophecy. He was a student of Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, the first chief rabbi. So this is the concept of a Nazir. So the Torah says that during the days of the Nazirus, he's not allowed to cut the hair. But what happens if suddenly he finds himself impure, she finds themselves impure? For example, somebody dies in the house, God forbid, and the Nazir becomes impure. They didn't do it intentionally. So what's the halacha? The halacha is that the Nazir has to go through purity, the regular purity. If somebody becomes impure, you have to sprinkle the ashes in the water of the red heifer on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day, that's going to be this week's Parshas Para. And on the 7th day, the Nazir again has to shave his hair. He has to shave his head, which he allowed the hair to grow long. And then on the 8th day, he has to bring offerings because he became suddenly impure. Excuse me. And then he goes back, he resumes the count. So here again, on the 7th day from the impurity, there's a mitzvah for the Nazir to cut off his hair and start the process all again. And then there's the whole procedure. What happens when the Nazir finishes his time frame of Nazirus? What does he do? He brings offerings. It's a whole process. And when he brings those offerings, it says that near the Mishkan, or near the Beis HaMikdash, at the entrance of the Oyel Maya, the Nazir shaves his head, and we take the hair of the Nazirite's head, and it's put on the fire that is under the feast peace offering. So the hair of the Nazir now becomes part of the karbonos. It's put on the fire that is under the shlomim, one of the offerings that he brings, a carbon shlomim, and the hair is burnt in that fire. And then there's the whole process of what they do with the offerings and who eats it and how it gets cooked. And then the Nazir goes back to regular life. He could drink wine and he could just resume regular life. So here we have 3 situations where there's a mitzvah to cut hair. When we have the Metzora, as we discussed, we have the Levi, and we have the Nazir. The difference is, remember, the Levi is only a temporary mitzvah. The Nazir and the Metzora are mitzvahs that are for eternity if the circumstances call for them. If the circumstances don't call for them, they don't call for them. That's what he says. The Nazir, when his days are up, his time frame for Nazirus is up, there's a mitzvah that he cuts his hair and he brings his offerings. And also, if by mistake he becomes tameh, or not by mistake, he becomes tameh. Shenema b'seder nasai v'gila achanazir. The Nazir has to shave. But that's only when his time is up. Or if he becomes impure during his days of being a nazirite. If he becomes tamei even in the middle of the era, of the time frame of his nazirus, mitzvah sheyigalech v'yavi carbon. It's a mitzvah that he should shave his hair on his head and bring a carbon. V'az yashav v'yigadol pera kebetchila b'kedusha. And then he resumes the mitzvah of nazirus, and again he grows his hair like he did it in the beginning in holiness. Minyan kol yemei nazirus she'asr al nafsha. During that number that he prohibited himself, he made a commitment to. So let's say I made a commitment that I want to be a nazir for 1 year, 12 months. Okay. After 6 months, suddenly I become impure. Let's say by mistake. I didn't mean it. Somebody died, I touched the corpse, I'm in the same tent. So what's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is I have to cut my hair and start all over again. Why? Because I became tamei in middle. What if I didn't become tamei? At the end of the 12 months, I go to the Beis HaMikdash, I bring my karbanos, and again I shave my hair. But while you're a nazir, you're not allowed to touch your hair. You're not allowed to shave. Mitzvah Shmini and Gimel. This is mitzvah 373 in the Chinuch. He's not allowed to cut his hair. A razor is not allowed to go over his head. But midbar vav hey. This is Parshas Monsey, the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verse 5. Not only you're not allowed to, Mitzvosecha sheyagdil sarai. It's a positive mitzvah to let his hair grow. Kamashakasav mitzvah Shmini and Dalet. This is mitzvah 374. Sheyagdil sarai kol yemei nizra shenemar kodesh yiyah gadol peres arash. It's not just kodesh yiyah gadol peres arash. It's not just you're not allowed to shave your hair. On the contrary, just like it's a mitzvah to put on tefillin, and it's a mitzvah to hear shofar, it's a mitzvah to shake lulav, it's a mitzvah to give charity. It's a mitzvah for him to let his hair grow long. Kadosh yiyah, what does it say? He should be holy. Gadol pera, what's gadol pera? Gadol pera is to grow his hair. Gadol pera is the hair. Sa'ar roshi, the hair on top of his head, he has to let grow. So what did we learn till now? What's the summation? The summation is that the Mishnah tells us there are 3 instances where the Torah wants a person, it's a mitzvah, it's not just voluntary, it's a mitzvah to shave the hair, which is a Metzora, a Levi during the desert era, not afterwards, and a nazir. But with a nazir, it's only when he finishes or she finishes, but the nazir is man or woman, no difference. When he or she finishes the nazirus time frame, before that, they're not allowed to cut their hair. They have to let it grow and grow and grow. And if it's a nazir for 10 years or 20 years, your hair is going to be long. And you're not allowed to cut it. It's a mitzvah to let the hair grow. If you become tamei, before you start again, you have to cut it. And at the end of the nazirus, again, you cut the hair. And that's what the Mishnah means in the Goyim, that there's 3 situations where we shave and it's a mitzvah. Says it's a machzadak, lahavin kolza. To understand this. What is the meaning of this? In other words, what is the meaning behind this mitzvah? What's the significance of hair? Why is the Nazir not allowed to cut his hair, but then he has to cut his hair? Why should the Levi cut his hair and not the Kohen? Why should the Metzora cut his hair? What do you care if he doesn't cut his hair? Let him leave his hair. Why doesn't it apply to other people? Lahavin kolza, to understand this. Hine yesh levaya kolza, we can explain all of this, al pi masha shamanu, based on what we heard. Now what does he mean, what we heard? When he says what we heard, it means what we heard from my grandfather. He doesn't even specify because it's so clear. What we heard is the Torah that we heard from my grandfather. Al pi masha shamanu, he says what we heard. Because it wasn't just what he heard himself. It was a Maamer that the Alter Rebbe said. Parshas Kiseitze Tov Kuf Samach Hey, I believe 1805. 1805. Parshas Kiseitze, there's a Maamer from the Alter Rebbe. And the Tzemach Tzedek is going to rephrase here what we heard. He was a young man, but he grew up by his grandfather, so he heard it as well. A Maamer that we heard from the Alter Rebbe, and based on that teaching of the Alter Rebbe, this Maamer is going to be developed. Based on Al Pasuk V'Gilchas Roisha. There's another fascinating instance where the Torah speaks about shaving. What is that? Dvarim Chaf Aleph Yud Beis Parshas Kiseitze Shenemar B'Yifas Toya. The mitzvah that's discussed. Remember Eishes Yifas Toya and Parshas Kiseitze. Let me give you again the context, so we will understand the point. The Torah says in Parshas Kiseitze, it's a very unique and unusual mitzvah, and obviously it's a complex mitzvah. And the mitzvah is If you go out to war, and as you know, people during war is not a simple thing. Sadly, we're all, our world is now engulfed in the war between Russia and Ukraine. But war, it's not just the casualties of war. Of course, the victims of war, the death, the wounded, the humanitarian crisis, the starvation, the illness, the etc., etc. It's also the way it affects the soldiers. Even those who survive, we're not only talking about those who are killed and wounded, even those who survive. The PTSD, I don't know if you know that the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is not an old term. It was coined in recent decades based on doctors and psychologists who were dealing with soldiers who came back from Vietnam. If you're familiar with the history of it, it's a very interesting history. It's not for now to get into, but this is when they realized there's a syndrome called post-traumatic stress disorder that was not part of the ancient diagnosis. For thousands of years it existed, but there's no diagnosis. Now here's the word, here's the we always have to understand. When we don't have language for something, it doesn't exist. Not because it doesn't exist, but because we don't know how to talk about it. That's why it's so important when children are growing up that we give language to their emotions. Because if not, they're not allowed to legitimize their emotions, right? If you can't talk about emotions in the house, what happens? If I'm a child and I'm having a lot of emotions, so I say, I must be meshiga, or I must be crazy, or I must be bad, because this is like not part, there's no language for it, it can't exist. So what I'm feeling is either I'm just a weird person, or a very, very big problem case, and it can create a lot of not unnecessary conflict and tension and anxiety. So language is so important. Language is very, very important. This mitzvah articulates and pays tribute to the crazy PTSD, not just when you come back from war, of course, but even more when you're in the conflict. The impulses are crazy. People see death all over the place. And something happens to you. You see your own friends die. And there's certain instincts that we don't want to know about that come out. It's not a simple thing. And this is the uniqueness. You can't understand the beginning of this mitzvah without understanding this, that the Torah understood what happens to people, soldiers during war. And therefore the Torah says you're going to see a woman. And by war, there's no rules. This is before Geneva Convention. But in Torah, there's always a Geneva Convention. So Torah doesn't tell the soldier, just be a good person, go back to yeshiva. He's in a war zone. So the Torah prescribes the way to do it with limits in order to help this soldier deal with the situation under the circumstances. So it's not a simple mitzvah to understand. Chazal say about this mitzvah, Dibra Torah keneged Yetzer Hara. The Torah here is talking about the Yetzer Hara of war, which could bring to the worst atrocities. And therefore, to ignore it and make believe nothing is happening, this person is overwhelmed. And if you don't let him have any of it, it can bring further consequences. A very interesting mitzvah. So there's like a certain compromise, which is very hard for us to understand, because thank God, most of us are living in prosperity and we're very irritated by such a mitzvah. I'm just being frank with you. But if you understand the circumstances, you can appreciate the mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? So it says you go to war. It's the beginning of Parshas Shmini. Among the captivity, those taken captive, you see a woman, and she's beautiful. And the soldier has a desire for her. He has a desire for her. So the Torah says something fascinating. He says, okay, I hear, but there's a process. Do not act just on raw impulse, which can cause untold harm to you and to her, and you're going to later regret it. So Torah says, take her to the house. You could take her to the house. And here there's a mitzvah of a gilches roisha. Allow her to shave, allow her to shave her head. She should shave her head. Her nails should grow. Remove the garments of the captivity from her. Let her dwell in your house. You have to feed her, take care of her, and let her weep for her father and mother for a full month. For a full month. And then you can be with her physically, and you could live with her, and you can marry her. But if you did not desire her, then you don't keep her. You send her free, let her go back to her nation, let her go back to her people. Do not sell her for money. In ancient in ancient times when there was slavery, do not enslave her. You have afflicted her, you have taken her. She was in combat, she's a victim of combat. You don't want to marry her, you're not going to treat her as a spouse, fine, but let her go. Let her go free, let her go back. No. This is a very, very interesting mitzvah. Interesting, complex, sensitive, and nuanced mitzvah. What does it mean? Oh, wow, it's so late. Okay, so I'm just going to explain this very briefly because we want to get to the explanation of the Tzemach Tzedek. We're going to learn till 8:45 today. The Torah is responding to the inflamed passion of a soldier in battle. So he sees a woman among the enemy captives. He feels an uncontrollable desire for her. I don't have to elaborate what used to happen in war zones with men, soldiers, women, children. You could read about this in history of war, not only in ancient times, but even in modern times, and very, very sophisticated and apparently law-abiding citizens and soldiers who otherwise would be mentioned. It's not a simple thing. So the Torah recognizes that this soldier who has this uncontrollable desire may not be able to restrain himself. So what do? You tell him, don't do anything, be a mensch, take out your Gemara and start learning. But that may lead to just an absolute breakdown of the system and really, really negative consequences. So the Torah provides an avenue for the lustful soldier to satisfy his desire. And I find this to be a fascinating mitzvah. You can't just destroy lust. Don't lust. Go be a mensch. He's in war. There's death all over the place. Either you acknowledge the lust and you somehow harness it, or you lose it. He's going to lose it. It's a very interesting mitzvah. Now you could say, no, he's very disciplined. You have to know war. If you don't know war, you don't know war. If you know war. So the Torah wants to provide an avenue for the lustful soldier. Why? So that it will cool off before he causes more harm. It's a very fascinating psychological way of dealing with it. As I told you, our sages say, this is a mitzvah that's a response to the Yetzer Hara. Now, according to Rashi and Rambam's understanding of this mitzvah, the soldier is not allowed to touch the woman. He's not allowed to chas v'shalom molest, violate the woman. Not allowed to. He's permitted to take her, and she should go through the process the Torah describes, and then they can get married. Now, since he knows that she will become permitted later, so the Torah hopes he's willing to wait rather than do something right now which is inappropriate. This is how Rashi and the Rambam say it. I should just add that there are some commentators who say that he's allowed to have relations with her one time, even before this whole process of conversion and weeping for her parents, and then she makes a decision, he makes a decision, does he want to marry her or not? But after that one time, never again, before we go through this whole procedure. That's other opinions. Rashi and Rambam disagree, says he has to wait completely. According to either interpretation, the purpose of the delay is so that the captor's desire will evaporate, will cool down during this time, and he'll look at her, she's a woman, she has a family, she has a nation, hopefully they're alive, maybe not, and she'll go free. That's mitzvahs eishes yifasta. There's a lot more to say about this, but that's the key. One of the things is v'gilches reisha. Sometimes the way they used to dress up the women, what used to happen is, this is interesting, they used to, it's another tragedy, they used to dress up the girls and the women in war with very, very beautiful clothes, and they would adore them, their body and their physique, because they wanted to lure they wanted to lure the Jewish men. We see that by Midian and Moav. The women are the ones who lured them into their emotional trap, and then they had them serve idolatry. So the Torah knew that. The Torah says, sometimes you're overwhelmed from the first sight, so shave her hair, take off the clothes, let her weep for her parents. Don't just jump into it. And then you'll see if there's a real relationship here. Because so many relationships are fake. Now this teaches us something else. A lot of relationships are fake. You get overwhelmed by a sight just because you're in a difficult state. So you fall in love, I have a crush, I'm overwhelmed, yeah, I want you for life. And then after a few years, it's al-chalam shechol ma'achedim al-achedim. It's such an important mitzvah. The Torah says, patience. Let's see without the fancy clothes, without the beautiful hair, without the long nails. That's a very interesting mitzvah. A lot of things, they schlep you into temptation because it's so powerful. There's an allure and it triggers something in you. This deep void, this deep need, this deep lust. But if you wait a month and you get rid of the outer stuff, the pnimius, it's not for you, she's not for you, let her go back. So it's a very, very interesting mitzvah. You always have to tell people, these things, you're making a decision for life. Wait a little bit, see what's behind. I can't wait, she is mine, sometimes, teenagers come, young bachrim come, young girls come, they saw something and they're overwhelmed and now they're making a decision for the next 85 years. I said, listen. Maybe you're right, but maybe you're not right. Let's figure this out, But people don't realize because when the blood, the oven is burning, so the seichel is in the air. That's how it is, right? People don't think. I was once speaking at Duke University. We had a few hundred students. I was talking about dating from a Jewish perspective, dating and relationships. So one of the students raises his hand and he says, do you, in your world, do you touch your girlfriend before marriage? Are you together? So I said, no. So he starts laughing and he says, you're giving advice to students in Duke University in the 21st century about dating and marriage when you come from the Stone Age. You're from before the Big Bang. Who today doesn't spend a few years, at least a few months, with your girlfriend, with your boyfriend before you get married, right? It was a challenging moment. So I still remember I said that on the contrary, I said, look, it's a fascinating thing. Look at the divorce rate today. What do you attribute that to? Our grandparents didn't live together and they were married for so many years. They stayed married. Today, everybody lives together before the marriage, so they should stay married even longer because they already know everything. Why is it the other way around? So there's a lot of different reasons. I said one of them maybe has to do with the fact that what happens is when you get physically involved, you're so overwhelmed and you're intoxicated, and maybe you never take the time to really connect to the personality of the person. And then 2 or 3 years later, you're bored from each other. People's bodies change, you find somebody else, people's looks change. I said in the system of halach, in the system of Judaism, dating is designated for one purpose only, to get to know the pnimius, my values, my personality, who I am as a person. Those things are not going to change. They're going to be there till you're 70, 80, 90. Your sense of humor, your views on life, what are your priorities, what do you live for, what makes you happy, what makes you sad, what are your deep, deep primal drives, if you could know them when you're dating. What are your insecurities, what are your skeletons, what are your blessings, what are your challenges. This is where people could connect. Of course the physique is important, of course physicality is important, but it must be a continuum of trust, of loyalty, of dedication. I said, so don't dismiss your heritage as just being foolish and stupid, because maybe that's what allows for a much better relationship. And I got a big applause, And then a bunch of girls came over to me after. They said, wow. So should we really, when we date, we shouldn't touch any? I said, listen, you're going to have to figure that out. They're living in Duke as a secular environment. But I just wanted to tell you, just be cautious about these things. So that's what the Torah is telling us here. Don't jump in to a relationship because during war you were lustful. Take the time, take the patience. V'gilches roisha, here again, she shaves her hair. So that's Alter Rebbe said a Maamer on this mitzvah, kiseitze tavkuf samache. On that Maamer, this Maamer of the Tzemach Tzedek is based. What did we hear from the Alter Rebbe? So now he shifts right away, as often, from the concrete mitzvah to the spiritual mitzvah. Eishes Yifas Toyer has a literal meaning. It also has a spiritual meaning. What is it? Says the Tzemach Tzedek, Kinisbayir b'Torah al pasuk hanal. The Alter Rebbe explained on this pasuk, sheyifas toyar hi chelek haneshama she'ena mislabeshes beguf, ki yemay medes b'bchinas makif mimal. Yifas toyar, which means the beautiful one, represents the soul that does not become manifested in the body. It remains hovering above the body. Above the body doesn't mean only on top of the body, also. But it means it's that energy level that the person doesn't consciously feel and experience in their visceral self necessarily. Shenikras Kain, why is it called Yifas Tayar? Al Sibas Hayoisen Imsheches Mebchinas Klolus Kama Bchinos. Because the soul is never one-dimensional. It comes from the cohesiveness, from the synthesis and integration of various divine qualities. Shemizeh ba hayofi. From this always comes beauty. Kamoi begashmi is just like physically. Gavan echad eina yafa kol kach. One color is nice, but it's not so beautiful. Aval k'shadavar echad yesh bei kama gvanim yachad. When something has multicolors, it has diverse colors. Hu yafa v'nechmad lamara. It's pleasing to the eye's palate. It's attractive, it's appealing. V'chein b'chinas tiferes klula michesed u'gvura yachad kenoida liyoide chein. Tiferes means beauty is always about symmetry and harmony. It encompasses chesed and gvura, as is known liyoide chein. Chein is an acronym. Chachma nistara. It's known to those who know Kabbalah, mysticism. So what's Yifas Tayar? Beauty. What creates beauty? Symmetry, harmony, various forces, various sounds, voices, colors, aspects coming together, creating synthesis, integration. One color is also beautiful. And something that's one-dimensional also has a beauty. But real beauty always comes from balance, from integration. Just like think of a symphony, think of a choir, the voices merging. Think of a song, of a ballad, where diverse notes come together to create a melody, to create a niggin, to create a song. Think of a piece of art. Think of a physique of a body. It's all about symmetry. And when the symmetry is balanced, that's what creates yoifi. So he says the neshama is called Yifas Tayar. Which neshama? Major part of the soul is not embodied. It doesn't manifest itself consciously. It has an impact on me. Sometimes you'll say, this person has a halo around them, right? This person, it gives off a light. It's not tangible. It's not something you said. It's something intangible. It's a halo. Or you'll speak about the subconscious that impacts you, internal drives that impact, but I don't know them. That's all part of the neshama that's not manifested. But sometimes it may be responsible for much more of my personality than anything else. Right? Most of ourselves we don't know. I don't know most parts of myself. So the neshama, most of the neshama is not manifested in the body. It's there. It's all there, but it's called makif. It hovers above us. That's called Yifas Tayar. Why? Because it's not one-dimensional. It's made up of a symmetry, a diversity. It's multicolorful. It encompasses many aspects of divine energy. What's Eishes Yifas Tayar? Haynu chelik men hashama hamalubish beguf shubchinas mekabel mechelik hanashama habilti mislabish beguf anikras Yifas Tayar. What's Eishes Yifas Tayar? The wife, which is beautiful. So he says it means the wife of the beautiful one. The part of the soul that is manifested in the body. The part of the self that's manifest, that's called Eishes Yifas Tayar. She is the wife of the soul. What does it mean, wife of the soul? She receives, just like a woman who absorbs absorbs and intensifies and gives back to the husband. She is the ultimate makabel, which becomes the ultimate mashpia through makabel. It's like the earth. You put in the seed and the earth gives you back a tree. The husband grants the seed of life, and the woman absorbs it and conceives it together with the egg, and it develops. She gives us a child. She gives the world a child. So she's the makabel that receives and absorbs. So the neshama that goes into the body, what do I mean goes in? It's manifested and revealed through the body. The part of self that's manifested through the body receives. She's makabel from the soul that's not manifested in the body. So she's called Eishes Yefas Toyar, the wife, the spouse of the Yefas Toyar. Now, this Eishes Yefas Toyar was in a war, and she was kidnapped. The enemy was taken into captivity. POWs, prisoners of war. What does this mean? It means that our beautiful wife, Eishes Yefas Toyar, is my soul is in captivity. It's an exile. Where is it an exile? It's an exile in my reptilian brain, in my mammalian brain, in my animal consciousness. Ubeguf. And it's in exile in my body, which I'm not recognizing its true values. It's stuck in my body, or it's stuck in my reptilian brain. In other words, I don't have access to the expansiveness of the self. My divinity is limited, it's narrow, it's in exile. The body, if it's not refined, is defined in Zohar as the skin, the hide, the skin of the snake. And then the midos are the dispositions, the characteristics, and the garments of the animal soul. They rule the divine soul, as explained in Tanya, chapter 11. In the war of life, you're going to find in captivity the beautiful woman, which is your soul. You're going to find that your soul is in captivity. And what do you have to do? You want to take her out of prison. You want to take her out of captivity. You want to take her out of exile. You want that she should run the house. You want that this beautiful woman should rule. You want that the body and the animal soul should be a continuum to the divine consciousness, not the other way around. Not the other way around, that my prefrontal lobes and my godly soul are stuck in my reptile and in my crocodile and in my lizard and in my mammal. I want it to be the other way around. I want that all the parts of my brain and my consciousness should be a continuum and a flow of my divine consciousness. So then what happens? The Torah says, you want to desire the soul. I want the soul. V'gilches roisha. And you shave her here. What does this mean? Whose hair do you shave? Your soul's hair? Peter said, Alter Rebbe said, v'chashaktaba means, hu'inyan hisabchus hamidus royes. First thing is, you have to want your soul. V'chashaktaba. You desire this woman. It's not just if you desire this woman. You desire this woman. I have to be able to learn about the transformation of the midos that seem so negative, but really, they can all be transformed. Because essentially, all the midos are survival, coping mechanisms. So when I release my soul and I see what I really need, I can transform my negative midas. Sham, as the Alter Rebbe explained, Pirush v'gilches, B'shakasav Sham, Pirush v'gilches roisha. What's shaving the hair of the head? Hupchinas havaras halavushim tsoyim the nefesh abahamis al kolponim k'mishenisbayir sham perikid beis. Sometimes I'm not ready to transform the midas, but at least I could remove the filthy garments that my animal soul got dressed in order to survive. I can't always transform the internal dynamics yet. That's v'chashakta, but at least I could take off the roish of the levushim tzayim. What are these levushim tzayim? This the Tzemach Tzedek is going to explain in the next piece, based on what he heard from the Alter Rebbe, which is going to bring us back to understanding the whole concept of hair in Judaism, which will help us understand this whole sugya. Be'ezer Hashem, we will continue this next time. In the meantime, I wish you all a beautiful day. And tomorrow, Tuesday, we have our regular women's class, 12:45 p.m. It's in the tent on 820 for Shea. All women and girls are invited. And it's also going to be live streamed on the website, theyeshiva.net. Have a hatzlacha and a beautiful day. Thank you. Question. I once heard about the Derech that the reason he didn't cut his hair because he said that physically it hurt him. It was like cutting nerves because of his brilliance. Yes, it's possible. They said that it was very hard for him. There was like something alive in his hair. Like I don't know what that means scientifically, but apparently it literally hurt him because of his brilliance. Now it's going to be explained in this Maamer what hair is, and then we'll understand. Some say that Tzemach Tzedek told the Derech when he was a child to learn Meseches Nazir, and he felt that he had a connection to Naziris even though he wasn't officially a Nazir. Others say that for the Derech he says the hardest day for him is Shabbos because he can't write down his thoughts and his mind was overwhelmingly brilliant. So some say just the time when he would take a haircut and take off his yarmulke, he wouldn't be able to think Torah, so he decided that it's not for him. You have to understand that Derech was a person that 24 hours a day there was nothing but Torah. It wasn't just that he learned. His mind was a different mind. He saw the world through Torah. It was something unique in many generations. It's a very interesting thing what happened with the Derech that he Pasha didn't cut his hair. Question. Thank you for explaining this mitzvah of Eishes Yefas Torah, which always perturbed me. Yeah, it's not an easy mitzvah. It's a hard mitzvah, but I'm saying you have to understand what happens during war. If you ignore it, just tell them to be moral. It's very nice to tell people to be moral when all humanity, when they're facing a crisis that shatters the basic structures that keep us civil. It's like imagine chas v'shalom, people are stuck in a situation where there's no food and there's no water. You know what they do to each other? It's very hard to judge people during such moments because if you ever heard of the Jews in the camps, how the starvation, your humanity is taken away from you. And when humanity is taken away from you, things are dangerous. So I actually find it comforting that the Torah acknowledges how difficult it is, how insane it is. Yeah, it's not a simple thing. Okay. Have a beautiful day, everybody.